power behind it.
Very interested in all this stuff.
All right, Mr. Rose, are we going to get started? All right. Hey, everyone. Hey, I'm Cayle Bradley. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. We're a partner in the Star Tides. So first I want to say thanks to Lynn and the George Mason University folks for having us be part of this program. I'm pretty new to this, so really excited to be here. So what I want to do is I'll do a quick introduction. So I'm with the Navy. So again, Naval Postgraduate School, Naval being Navy and Marine Corps. But want to provide some perspective on how we see climate impacts to like our missions. And then I'm going to introduce, I'll have our panelists introduce themselves, and we'll open up with some questions. Okay, so with that, let me start with the introduction of myself. Again, Cayle Bradley. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. I've been with the Navy for about 20 years. That's combined uniform service, so 8 years enlisted, doing acoustics, got out and went to college, studied naval architecture, came to work as a civilian, so civil servant at Carter Rock, which is a kind of local area, Navy lab. We did a lot of ship R&D, ship design work. I did primarily energy technology integration on ships. I did that for about 6 years and then went to the Pentagon. I was at the Pentagon for about 5 years. While at the Pentagon, I was a requirements officer for the Navy Energy Program, primarily overseeing energy technology R&D for Navy ships and aircraft, but a lot of engagement with the installations folks around energy resilience, R&D that supports being more resilient from our shore-based facilities, but then also a lot of engagement with the Marine Corps. So we talk about expeditionary capabilities. It's a lot of the same demand response, emergency demand response capabilities that we've heard about today and yesterday from FEMA, NIST, et cetera, around being able to deploy some kind of emergency capability. And I'll get into a little bit more of that in a minute. But again, 5 years at the Pentagon, a lot of engagement with other DoD folks, including, hope you caught the keynote speech yesterday from our DoD rep. So a lot of that language is shared across the DoD, across the representatives. So Naval Postgraduate School, I'll say somewhat recently getting into the climate literacy, climate education game. Secretary of the Navy, Mr. Del Toro, Honorable Mr. Del Toro, made it a priority shortly after President Biden made it a priority that we understand climate impacts to our operations, and then also be able to adapt to those impacts and then mitigate those impacts. So our leader, so Secretary Del Toro, made it a priority. Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. Hope you guys can get out there sometime. Beautiful area. Set up a program. Actually went into a partnership with Stanford to identify innovations in sensoring and forecasting and technologies for energy and water production, et cetera, so that we could be more resilient to climate impacts. So 5 years, again, come back to the Pentagon. So 5 years at the Pentagon and Navy staff supporting largely energy R&D, but those last 2 years, a lot of focus on climate. And what I found when we'd engage with leadership, including Secretary of Defense, around climate, we use a lot of big words like, well, I'll say requirement itself is maybe a big word and maybe not always well understood, but existential was one that really gripped me. And I said, well, how do we just scoot through that word in a speech and not really dive into what it means to be existential? And it dawned on me, I didn't really fully appreciate impacts of climate to operations, to our planet. I am a father. So in February of this year, I came over to the Naval Postgraduate School, largely so I can better understand climate impacts to civilization, but also have a lot of perspective in climate impacts to operations. So hoping we don't talk too much about the Navy mission and impacts to the Navy mission, but I'll tell you now, we share a lot of the same challenges we've heard about, again, in Puerto Rico and elsewhere. I'll say a lot of the same capabilities that are being developed to respond to climate-related impacts. As we all know, those climate-related impacts are becoming more severe, more frequent. A lot of those same capabilities are capabilities that we've invested in for decades to respond to global wartime-like conflict. And I'll tell you, generally, we don't budget for the, it's called humanitarian aid and disaster relief mission. We do the mission. We responded to Puerto Rico and Haiti and elsewhere, Katrina. We respond to the mission, but it's because we have those capabilities in-house already. So when our aircraft carriers or our amphibs or our hospital ships, they respond to these events, it's because those platforms were ready to go to war. They had water production facilities and medical facilities and capabilities to deploy Marines, so you name it, tents and cooking supplies and solar panels and you name it. And all these things are very helpful, as you know, in the humanitarian aid and disaster relief. We call it HADAR. And if you know the Navy or DoD, we use a lot of acronyms. So in the HADAR mission is generally a lot of the same capabilities. So the resourcing. So come back to requirement. And just so you know, I was a requirements officer. If you don't know what that means, everything we invest in the Navy, at least in theory, is aligned to a requirement that's been well assessed, well understood. And as a requirements officer for energy resilience, you know, we want to make sure that we can deploy our Marines and our sailors and then work with our partners and the Joint Force, which is the Army and the Air Force, et cetera, to be able to deploy our war fighter, right? So we invest a lot into that capability, into that requirement. And again, it supports the climate mission. Okay, all that said, it's an interesting time because the innovation and the entrepreneurship that we're seeing from industry and academia, et cetera, we can take advantage of that too for our mission. Not to say that we're not also focused on the climate, climate impacts and adaptation. We are very focused on that. But when we assess what climate's going to do in defense, it's what's it going to do to prevent us from achieving our mission. All right, so what are we talking about in the Navy? Again, when you think Navy, think about Navy and Marine Corps for a minute. We're the only global force on the planet. We're the only combat force that is global, and as climate impacts start to affect the oceans, certain bases and shore establishments, where we rely on maybe getting fuel and logistics and products and materials, as those become impacted, we got to overcome that, right? So we got to plan for that. As the oceans change, we're looking at salinity changes from melting Arctic. We're seeing salinity increase in areas and salinity decrease in areas. We have a lot of submarines out there, right? Submarines under the ocean that rely on acoustics. They don't have windows, right? They rely on acoustics to move around down there. And if the acoustics equation is based on salinity, pressure, temperature, et cetera, that's a challenge for us. We're continuing assessing that. The Arctic, again, if you caught the keynote speech yesterday or the panel yesterday, a lot of discussion around Arctic and the challenges that the Arctic's bringing to the defense. We got to be able to operate and respond in the Arctic now, and we expect to have to respond more so in the future. So planning for that. All right, so this panel, a lot of that's around mission and trying to provide that perspective, but this panel really focused on energy resilience. Again, I'm a civil servant, so I work for the Naval Postgraduate School. We are an education activity, but we're also a government activity. So I'm a GS employee. And I have a lot of GS, so government perspective on things. So in the panel, the hope is when we open up for questions, if you got questions that I can answer, I want to answer it. But I also want to lean on the panelists here. A lot of great panelists, but I wanted to bring here some entrepreneurship, some folks who appreciate how to engage with government, how to find resources with government. They understand my problems and the government problem from DoD, Navy, and the other services perspective. But they've also got that outside perspective where they've engaged, academia, industry, a lot of folks that are here today. So hopefully you can find resources here. So with that, I'm gonna have our panelists introduce themselves. Again, I'm Cayle Bradley. I won't introduce myself again. Have the panelists introduce themselves, maybe provide a bit of perspective on how you see challenges to, I guess, energy resilience and maybe climate impacts. And then after we've all kind of gone through that and introduced ourselves, we'll have our moderator, Mr. Rose, here, come up and ask us a few questions, kind of get the juices flowing. I'll grab a seat, and then we'll open it up to the audience. We're really hoping to use a good chunk of this time for the audience to engage us and hopefully we can provide some good narrative. All right, let's start down at the end there. Mr. Mike Mazzocco, if you will, please.
Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Mike Mazzocco. Nice to meet everybody. I'm a CEO, founder, and owner of Alytic. I've worked with and for Cayle over the years when he was working up at Carter Rock in an RDT&E program. And so we were looking at integrating energy capability and technology within the military Sea Lift Command. So those are the ships, the logistics ships to the Navy. And we set up a program. It was worth probably about $160 million over the FIDIP. This is back in the Obama administration. So energy technology integration has kind of ebbed and flowed over the years with the administrations. Just to bring you up to date, kind of what I'm doing now is I'm doing more supportability analysis of the Navy supply chain. So looking how does the Navy push fuel and energy forward in contested environments. And so we're looking at modeling. We model the supply chain. We look at new technologies, see if they're supportable. And then we model attrition. So it's more that Navy mission, maybe that you don't want to talk about. That's really my expertise. But I've also fancy myself an entrepreneur. I have a few patents. I've actually worked with George Mason in the National Science Foundation with the I-Corps program, ICAP over the last couple of years. So if you're an entrepreneur or if you are a small company, mid-sized company, large company, and you want to know, how do I get my idea, my concept, my technology in front of the government? In this case, I would say the Navy and the Marine Corps. I can be of assistance that way. So if you want to talk about those types of issues, that's really my expertise. On the climate change, I'll leave it to these guys from there. Right?
Well, thanks. Brett Strogen. I guess just to back up, two real themes that have gone through my academic career and professional career are interest in energy technology innovation and environmental protection. So academic background in environmental engineering, bachelor's, master's, and PhD. Did a postdoc in economics, looking at alternative fuel infrastructure. So I worked in the private sector for maybe 8 years or so, and a few years in traditional environmental consulting, a year for a startup doing life cycle assessment of emerging technologies, a little over a year in government relations and lobbying, so helping innovative technology companies figure out how to navigate government funding, specifically DoD. The biggest portion of my career was at the Pentagon, so I worked for 5 years in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, what we call OSD, in the Operational Energy Innovation Team. So there we funded a lot of applied research development, alternative energy technologies for deployed applications. I was the resident guru or stucky for alternative fuels, which was a very controversial topic, especially among members of Congress. So the DoD was at the time under the Obama administration, and Secretary Ray Mavis of the Navy was leaning very far forward on renewable energy and alternative fuels, specifically biofuels for tactical operations. So what's now called alternative jet fuel or sustainable aviation fuel. That was the main focus, being from bio products. And on the ship side, distillate fuel F-76, also made from bioproducts, was a big interest item. And there's also a lot of interest in microreactors. So I was the executive secretary for the Defense Science Board study on the feasibility of microreactors for forward operating bases, which was also a very controversial topic at the time. So my boss said I basically got the ugliest portfolio of anyone in the office. We got beat up on and asked annoying questions from Congress and folks inside the Pentagon on why the heck we're investing money or why we're bothering looking at these technologies that arguably don't offer a ton of utility today, and can chew up a lot of R&D dollars that could be used for other opportunities. So I was in OSD for 5 years, 2 years as a science policy fellow through the AAAS program, 3 years as a contractor, and then I was an appointee in the Army Secretariat, kind of a counterpart office, where I was more focused on installation energy resilience. So as an interim program manager for performance contracting, where we partner with private sector, utilities and energy services companies to really use their expertise and capital funding to upgrade the utility systems at bases, improve the building energy performance, improve the resilience. Some of that due to concerns about cyber threats or kinetic threats, but climate change being one of the threats to continued operations at military bases. So I think that's enough my background. Excited to be here and to continue the dialogue. Over to you, Grant.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. As Cayle had mentioned, his 5 years in the Pentagon, Brett's couple years, and Mike, I know all these guys from those overlap a year, but Grant Kamins, I own the Meridian Group. It's a consulting practice that supports ASN, EINE, which again, we love in the Navy acronyms, but that's the Assistant Secretary for Energy, Installations, and Environment. And under that umbrella, I focus on installation energy. So these guys give a perspective on the OE or operational side, where mine is more so on the shore side and shore installation. So some of the things we've done over the past couple years and, you know, coming into the future are things like our 2912 program, which is a program that we're able to use energy savings that the Navy has incurred over the past couple years and bring them back. So it's before they go to the Treasury, these funds, they get put back and recolored and they go to the Navy to be able to focus on projects that increase energy resilience and energy security. There's a lot of other things we've been doing in the realm of climate. Our Assistant Secretary, Honorable Secretary Berger, just released in the past 5 or 6 months, Climate Action 2030, which lays out our goals as the Navy and how they parallel to Executive Order 14057 and 14008. So happy to be here. Glad to give a perspective on the shore side and looking forward to it.
All right, so before Mr. Rose, before you pick up some questions, just thanks to the panelists for coming. At NPS, we are I think I'm on here, right? Can you hear me? NPS, we're the panel coordinator for this particular panel, so the energy resilience panel. So I've asked these gentlemen to come support this panel. Gentlemen, thanks a lot for coming. Appreciate those perspectives already. One kind of dividing line that you kind of pointed out. So a lot of perspective on operational energy, and when we use that term, it was used a lot yesterday too, which is why I want to call this out. So operational energy, we're largely talking about ships, aircraft, ground transportation vehicles, things like that. So it's a lot of fuel. And when we're talking about operational energy, efficiency technologies, it's about how to reduce fuel use. When we're talking about installations energy, that's really the only other kind of energy we have. Well, besides nuclear, we kind of keep nuclear out of all of that. But on the installation side, it is what it sounds like. It's our buildings, the infrastructure, it's resilient, energy resilience primarily. So just want to make that clear. I've got a lot of perspective on the operational side. Mr. Kamins here, a lot of perspective on installation side, and then our other gentlemen, I mean, they kind of covered both a bit. So with that, Mr. Rose, if you have a few questions for us.
Yeah, thank you very much. And by way of introduction, my name is Aaron Rose. I'm the chair of the Star Ties Advisory Board, based in the San Francisco Bay Area. And it's interesting in the notion of energy resilience. During last night's keynote presentation, I learned that, interestingly, that Miramar base in Southern California can survive, I think she said 18 days.
21 days.
Or 21 days. 21 days. 21 days. Thank you for the correction. On just sole operation off the grid. And then we had a post dinner and where Craig Fugate, we talked and I'm a customer of PG&E where we deal with some of the rolling blackouts, and that has had an impact on my business. So we have a big gap, between sustainability and resilience in one area, and then our large dependence on energy and the impact that has when we're not able to access it. There's a material and economic impact. There's a humanitarian impact, and I'm hoping to flush some of these other issues out today. But really let's start off on what are your respective offices' priorities for addressing future gaps in the power and energy distribution in the face of climate change. And we'll start, Kyle, lead us off, please.
Yeah, certainly. So a couple of priorities. So first, for those interested, Mr. Kamins mentioned Climate Action 2030. If you Google that, you can find it. That's the Navy's strategy to date to address climate impacts. It's got a couple of objectives in mitigation, objectives in adaptation, some natural infrastructure objectives. I encourage everyone to pull that out. It's a great reference, and it's the formal Navy position. There is an implementation strategy that's coming out. Keep an eye out for that. I don't think it's out yet, but it's any day now. We're holding our breath at this point. So couple goals in that strategy that I think make sense here. On the mitigation side, and I hate to do this. I think this came up yesterday. The number of policy instructions and doctrine that we lean on in the DoD, it's kind of outrageous. But a couple other references that have already been mentioned: Executive Orders 14008, and then 14057. Yep, yeah, nailed it. Net government-wide net zero by 2050. That doesn't mean Navy net zero by 2050. Please keep that in mind. But we are on a government-wide coordinated approach to reducing our carbon, reducing carbon, decarbonization by 2050. And that's a lot of partnership with other, maritime transportation sectors like DOT, with installations. Hope you're all tracking the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of resources going to DOE. So DOE owns a lot of this plan and strategy. Come back to respective offices. So our approach is to be part of those plans. We've also accepted a big chunk of that responsibility. Another one of the 14057 objectives was a 65% reduction by 2030. Is that right? That's a big one. It's a tough one for us. And
yeah, I was just going to say from the levels of 2008 to 2030 is what we're going to now, and giving a tactical kind of perspective on this, what my team and we're actually working on now, and I didn't mention this before, but just to give you a kind of scene setting perspective and what the Navy's doing right now. My team and entrepreneurial, if you will, I'm still getting used to that word because we're fairly new. So we're under 2 years old, but since our inception in 2021, we brought on a climate scientist, a PhD, a hydrologist, someone to focus on Red Hill issues, and somebody to focus on energy financing, all within the Navy Secretariat to focus on these broader goals of energy and climate. And what I was going to say to Kyle's point is that one, along with the Climate Action 2030, you can look that up for a good reference, but the net zero, we do have a Marine Corps base, so under Department of Navy, Albany, Georgia, that is officially net zero. So another example for you to look up if you're strolling in board one day. But my point to Kyle's thing is who I support at the Navy, we have what's called installation energy and water plans. And what those do is they identify energy security gaps at each installation. And a lot of those gaps can be increased or caused by stressors, of climate change, whether that's heat to the grid and having to deal with rolling blackouts, sea level rise, as you know, the Navy's mostly on the coast due to mission, but all of those energy security gaps go back to one thing, and that's executing mission. So that's really what the Navy is focusing on. Yes, we're installation, operational energy perspective, but we're still mission focused all around.
So can I pick up on that mission focused? So again, these guys are in the Pentagon. I guess we're more tactical support, I'd say, closer to the fight. So we focus on, well, the Navy, when we first started trying to save energy on ships, it was a return on investment. Fuel savings. We quickly got refocused into how do you increase combat capability through your investment in energy. And so what we're looking at, again, is looking at the resiliency of the Navy supply chain as it pushes energy and fuel out into theater. And so our priorities, like for our offices, when I say that, it's more at the naval lab level, is looking at over the shore energy distribution in a contested environment. The Navy's gone to distributed maritime operations, or DMO. You often hear that. The Marine Corps equivalency is EABO, Expeditionary Advanced Based Operations. And so those doctrinal changes are really exposing gaps in our supply chain and our platforms. We don't have the capability to distribute fuel in a distributed way across, the network. So we're developing those systems, and I can talk to those a bit later.
So I'm gonna add just a couple things. If you go back this onion, so honestly, it's a lot of the same things that Beam is looking at, that others are looking at. It's about how do you get energy to austere locations, to forward locations. If you go outside, you see the tents out there. As soon as I walk up here, I'm like, is this a Marine Corps demonstration? If you go to a Marine Corps demonstration, forward operating bases, they require tents, very similar type tents. All that said, so it's all the same things that you're all looking at. It's the forecasting, so the sensing, be it in the Arctic or elsewhere. So understanding climate impacts, it's capabilities that will help us be more energy secure, so resilient to losses of the utility, of the local utility, in the continental United States, and then very similar capabilities that will enable, expeditionary operations, in islands, right, and maybe remote locations. And it's innovation that gets us to a sustainable fuel to support our mitigation objectives. But I'm gonna throw one more document out there. The DoD has a climate risk matrix, which kind of speaks to how the DoD sees climate impacting us, and it talks a lot about those things: adaptation, innovation necessary to enable adaptation and resilience, innovation necessary to realize the mitigation. Mitigation is part of our strategy, which is why I went into there first, why I went into the carbon reductions. We recognize the impact that carbon emissions has on future climate impacts. So we're hoping to reduce that with everyone else on the planet. But yeah, again, a lot of the same issues you're looking at, which is why I'm encouraged to be here, where there's innovators. Your demonstrations, I'm already excited to see some of the things that I wasn't aware even existed, but to see hopefully see some of those things come into government or DoD service.
The next question, and I'll actually provide a little bit of commentary on before opening up for response, but the question is really kind of innovations and technology. Are you really paying attention to that's got you excited? What I do for my day job is I'm an individual investor. I support startups, and renewable energy has been part of my portfolio for 20 years. And one of the things that I'm seeing that really gets me excited is more efficient use of energy. Solar panels have become much more efficient. They're becoming cheaper. There's still an issue about where they're manufactured. And so there's that issue when it comes to getting access to resources and minerals, which, we'd love to get the panelists to have share their opinion on. And distribution networks is very important. And so something that I'm looking at is more of the microgrids, and then how do you fit that into the larger grid, again, to avoid disruption and maximizing efficiency of the energy grid. The other area is, we talk about hydrogen, and we got green hydrogen and purple hydrogen and all these blue hydrogen. But the areas of green hydrogen, particularly that's being produced are the result of renewable energy. So I'd love to get the thoughts from the other panelists of what innovations are you looking at, and Brett, if you would lead us off, please.
Sure. So just going to comment on contrasting installation energy and operational energy a bit. So the installation energy part of the DoD is where there's a lot more cash constraints on the budget, and that's where they work with the private sector to get capital for investments that improve long-term energy resilience and efficiency. They're also constrained by some of these goals that the administration has for reducing emissions, the more environmentally focused goals. The operational energy side of DoD is where there is really that motivation to invest in research development and technology evaluation. So there's a lot more funding there, and I'd say that there is some political pressure to invest in renewables for the sake of it under certain administrations. But the most durable justification for R&D on the operational energy side of things is to improve capability, to reduce risk, and I'd say to improve flexibility of systems, both working interoperability, improving interoperability across the services within the United States military, but also working with NATO partners, and when that HADR mission comes out, making sure the systems work in those situations. So I'd say this is kind of the one challenge DoD has in this world is figuring out where to lead and where to monitor. So I'd say on the alternative fuels side of things, for example, with alternative jet fuels, et cetera, I'd say the most, especially during the Republican Congress years, the best justification for the DoD to invest in alternative fuels was really on the evaluation side of things to make sure if these fuels are available on the market, will they work in the DoD system? The most controversial investment in the alternative fuels world, just because I'm most familiar, is where the DoD was investing in actually new ways to make alternative fuels. That's arguably the DOE mission. These days, there's a lot of push towards electrification of everything, vehicles, not just ground vehicles, but even aircraft. So I'd say that, and the DoD, one of the coolest investments I celebrated in my old office in OSD was the tactical microgrid standard. So it's like the least sexy project it's sounding ever. It's coming up with standards for interconnections and protocols for batteries, generators, demand. But that standard, if we can get the private sector to use it and NATO allies to use it, enables systems that the DoD procures to work kind of plug and play, just like we do at home with chargers and stuff now, to work seamlessly with other partners and host nation equipment, and that just opens up a lot of capability and resilience and reduces a lot of headaches for the operators. And I'd say you asked about hydrogen. So hydrogen is one of those topics where I think there's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of environmentalist excitement about hydrogen being a zero emissions fuel. And there are limited cases where hydrogen has a huge operational advantage potentially for military applications. But I'm pretty bearish rather on the utility of hydrogen as a kind of a bulk fuel for DoD applications. I think for drones, it makes a lot of sense because hydrogen is the most energy dense by weight fuel out there. So you can have a really lightweight drone that has a lot of energy content, allows it to stay aloft for years, not necessarily years yet, but for days. Where for ground vehicles, and other platforms, I don't see a lot of utility for hydrogen in the DoD portfolio, that is. But curious what the other panelists think about that.
Go ahead.
So yeah, I'm trying to answer your question. So I angel invest as well, like you do, and I don't have too many. I guess I have a few investments in green energy, but from my perspective, kind of what I see and what the DoD and what the Navy is trying to do as far as new technologies is sometimes they don't even know what the requirements are. Sometimes they don't know what the problems are solving, so they'll come out to organizations or conferences like this and try to ask people, what are you working on? And if that's of interest, well, then maybe we can work with you and figure out how to get you funding. That's a long process, as the three of us know. We normally build our businesses, at least I have, on services, relationships, and then over time trying to get solutions in front of the government that they would invest in. So sometimes that's new concepts. And that's a longer path. So I struggled with that, with kind of this question coming into here. The government, they want great ideas, so sometimes they can't define the requirements, which makes it hard. If you're an entrepreneur here at George Mason, or you have a new technology, you're trying to figure out where do you go within the Navy and the government to get it funded. And so there's OTAs, there's symposiums, there's conferences that I'm a part of, like Tech Connect. That's an organization that puts on conferences. They work with the Navy SBIR program, Small Business Innovative Research. And we also, we've been putting together an operational energy and logistics summit, which is going to be hosted out in Hawaii as a part of Tech Connect. So these are symposium where if you have an idea, you can submit it, it can get graded and awarded funding, and then you can get in front of folks that have money and programs within the Navy to fund your idea. But it kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier with I-Core and doing customer discovery and figuring out, do you have a customer and do you have a market strategy for your idea so that the Navy would be interested in it to fund it to whatever ends, that they would have. So I don't know, I'm kind of talking in circles a bit, but there's a lot of give and take when it comes to technologies. As far as, ones that I'm excited about, they're probably not going to excite anybody in here. But we're trying to figure out, again, how to push fuel forward. So we have things like modular systems on tankers. It's called the modular console adapter kit. We have fueling stations that we're putting on civilian ships so that they can integrate with the Navy supply system at sea. New platforms like the light amphibious warship that will go into an island chain under a WEZ, a weapons engagement zone, and resupply the Marines. And then the Navy's working on the next generation logistics ships. So these are smaller ships that can operate distributedly and fuel our forces.
Grant, go ahead.
Sure, I was going to take it in a little bit of a different direction because any real technology innovation is going to come from the operational side. So these guys would have a better perspective than I would. What I will say though, and what excites me that related to that technology is the partnerships we have and we're developing and leveraging. Over the past year and a half, we've renewed our memorandum of understanding with the state of California. Now, what that's done, it's been able to let us work with bases in Southern California to do things like electrification blueprints on the bases, figuring out where and how and the best value to put charging stations and to help communities as well in the area with, say, traffic and things like that. So how better to partner with the state to not only help with DoD's mission of reducing our carbon, but also help the community as well. And a lot of partnerships with DOE, the Federal Energy Management Program, FEMP, who we've been partnering with at Department of Navy to look at some opportunities where we can work together to increase our installations, battery storage, backup generation. All of those things are things that excite me and what I've seen this administration and specifically our Secretary, Ms. Berger, leverage and really bring back to life.
Thanks. So I got a lot to say about this. So I'm gonna try to keep it concise. I'm gonna start with installations. Since coming to the Naval Postgraduate School, I guess I've gotten a better introduction to installations challenges. To include in the next couple of weeks, we're supporting we call it a tabletop exercise, but it's more of a workshop now. But really looking hard at some of the challenges associated with climate change to installations. Right now, we're looking at Southern California. So you've heard us talk about Miramar. Miramar, 21 days off the grid. That's an exception. Most of our bases have a lot of challenges. And if you look at the power stations, they're all pretty old. If you look at our backup generators, they're not designed for like long endurance operations. So technologies, I think I hear the term microgrid in a box on occasion, but things that will get us maybe a microgrid or some kind of capability to bring, let's call it critical mission capabilities back up and running when other things are starting to fail, and to do it over a long period of time. We can't deliver, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of microgrids in a box tomorrow. So we need to have the capability to be able to deploy them to the climate impacted environment or installation, right? The base. So think about Naval Base San Diego. There's a lot of ships there. Those ships can go on diesel power as long as they have fuel in them, right?
Yeah.
But what about the rest of the base? What are the capabilities on that base that this is rhetorical for now? What are the capabilities on that base that need power for us to assure the mission? So the microgrid, which includes everything that's in that box, right? It could be solar, it could be hydrokinetic power generation, but it's also the batteries. So battery R&D and innovation. I think we're seeing a lot of things happen with lithium, but there's a lot of safety concerns with lithium batteries, right? That said, I want to jump to operational. While I was at the Pentagon, so again, I mentioned requirements officer, Mike, you break my heart when you say that people don't understand the requirement, because that was my job.
Is that true?
That is true. It's hard to define the requirement in such a way that everyone can kind of relate to. But as a requirements officer, it was my position to define the requirement for fuels, for energy efficiency technologies for ships and aircraft, and for batteries. And then we were also the resource and requirements officer for the Office of Naval Research, which is generally mostly basic and applied research. So the requirements for those are kind of loose. We try to maintain those capabilities, but there is in that applied research area, we are trying to align that research and that innovation to capability gaps. I don't want to go into our gaps, but to come back to the question, like I've got some perspective on where we want to see innovation or where we're excited about the innovation. So in the fuel space, Mike mentioned distributed operations. You heard the term contested logistics or contested operations. What that means is how does the naval force operate in an area where the enemy is trying to engage us, right? It's contested. I mentioned we're forward, we're a global force, right? So the tyranny of distance. So we got to push all of our logistics out in the Western Pacific, right? That's a huge challenge. That logistics includes the fuel. So I'm excited about capabilities that can generate fuel in that environment. So we no longer, let's untether from that logistics chain. So part of the logistics chain is also food. So another innovation that we're really excited about is unmanned systems. What if you take the man out of it? Do we need food anymore? What about parts? Well, how do we get to a long endurance, low maintenance intervals between our unmanned systems? So that's something that's exciting. It's going to enable these smaller unmanned capabilities to operate in whatever remote location for long periods of time. If we could find some kind of expeditionary fuel generation capability, be it hydrogen, be it a drop-in fuel, sustainable aircraft fuel or otherwise, that's really exciting. And the front runner right now is hydrogen. What we're seeing is, if you've heard about the seawater to fuel project, we have been able to make fuel from seawater, but it takes a lot of energy to make fuel from seawater, right? So it's, but if we can get to the point where we can make fuel from seawater with less energy, then that's a real capability that's going to enable our mission. It's also going to potentially support some of these other humanitarian aid type missions. So if we can put a generation system that generates fuel that maybe can produce fuel for gas generators in a disaster impacted environment, that's going to help a lot of folks. So fuels, I'll be honest, a lot of the energy efficiency technologies that we've seen for ships and aircraft, we've kind of grabbed all the low hanging fruit, which includes LED lighting. There's some hull hydrodynamics and aircraft, wing aerodynamic efficiencies we've been able to realize. We're seeing some neat concepts in wing and body, I think is the term. Yep, different materials, certainly be able to think about unmanned systems again. Some of these materials and some of these blended wing body concepts are going to enable, higher G forces, and so we're really excited about where that's going. And it's all going to happen using less energy, and it might be able to happen using, again, hydrogen energy. So it all comes back to the fuels. I hate to say it, but a low carbon fuel that can be generated in theater. That's super exciting. And I got to shout out to water. There's this energy water nexus. When a location loses energy, next thing to go is water, right? Capabilities that innovations that'll allow us to make water on demand with less energy. And maybe it's RO, maybe it's some other new capability. We're excited about that. And that applies to installations, but also for our ships. I'm sure I can go into some rabbit holes here, but
Thank you, gentlemen. The next question, and then we'll open it up to the audience, either in person or online. Two ways to word this. I guess the one way I'll word it to have Grant, you can take the first shot, but from your background, word it this way, how does industry and academia get involved with government labs to partner in development of these concepts and technologies to enable energy resilience in the face of climate change? And then coming from the private sector, I can relate to this question more so. At the time, Mike, if you want to take the question of, what are the expectations of the private sector? I mean, one of the challenges has always been is that government is big, no matter what, whether it's municipal government, county government, state, or federal. Really, it's supposed to be serving the people. And how do you think, from your perspective, could the government provide a better service to help businesses of all sizes, particularly the smaller businesses, leverage and to be successful? Of course, Cayle and Brett, you can answer accordingly because you both have different perspectives. So, Mike, I'm sorry, Grant, if you can go first, please.
Sure,
and then
sure.
To you, Brett.
So yeah, that's a great question. Like Mike had mentioned, symposiums are a great way to get out and network and find that connection in the government who, is maybe looking for the technology you're bringing. It's not a super quick process, regardless of how you go, but definitely different networking events, partnerships. As Cayle just mentioned, there's a partnership event coming up next week where we're calling it a climate TTX, but it's between Naval Postgraduate School, Stanford, and the Department of Navy. I would say we do on the energy side of the house, the installation and facility side, we do a big event every year hosted by DOE, which is called Energy Exchange. There's a lot of different back and forths with government, private sector, nonprofits, all different people in different categories. So that's the best kind of way I would say is get out there, network, join these symposiums, try to get involved with some leadership at the school, and different organizations within the government.
Can I just add before I,
Sure.
what more specifically, what do you look for, or what could you use from the private sector in making your job better, your company more successful?
So that's a good question. So my company really focuses on policy and execution of that policy. So we have the Secretary Del Toro's goals. We have Ms. Berger's goals. And our job is to go out and figure out how to execute those goals, get the message out about these goals and say, hey, we're not joking around here. This is really what we're doing. So for me, it's a little different because I don't have a technology that I would come and say, hey, here's this. But what I do is I have subject matter experts or SMEs that can say, okay, from a broad perspective, Department of Navy, here's where you stand. In order to get to the goal that Secretary Del Toro has, you need to do X, Y, and Z, and put out different language and policy that instructs folks to execute those type of things. So again, kind of a roundabout way to answer your question, but for me, again, I'm not bringing a technology, it's more of the subject matter expertise and how things function within those 5 walls of the Pentagon and beyond that my team and I support.
Thank you. Mike?
And so I'm sitting here trying to think of a good answer, right? So my perspective from small business, so I'd have to answer it that way. And I've gone out and a lot of it's maybe on how dynamic the individual owner of that company and how passionate they are about whatever product or service that they're producing. So I live in King George, which is down near Dahlgren, Virginia. You know, I've talked to the board of supervisors. They have a small business kind of technology member that reaches out to small businesses and hosts events, things like that. So what I'm trying to get at is if the government have to understand the challenges of small business, and they say they try, they do, but if you ever hear, hey, just go look at Fed Biz Ops, it's never an answer. Right? It's an answer you get a lot, but that doesn't help us. So a lot of the challenges too, and I guess no matter what size business you have, if you want to work with the government contracting. And so I mentioned the OTAs, other transaction authority. You know, those were developed when we were trying to go to the moon in the 50s. And it was to help businesses cut through red tape, was help the government define a requirement that they needed to get us to the moon. So it's kind of a fast lane approach. And so I think we need to do, government needs to maybe employ those better. You know, it's always tough because nobody wants to go to jail in contracting, but it slows things down. And so instead of like doing lip service from the government perspective, is really trying to understand some of the challenges that small business have. They have set aside status. So like I'm SDVOSB, veteran owned small business. There's 8A, woman owned, and there's programs set up to do that. But it's still back incumbent on the leader of that company to have a product or service that somebody wants, that then they can take advantage of those set aside statuses and contracting. So I don't know, Grant, you're shaking your head a lot.
Oh, yeah, I was just agreeing with everything.
Okay,
Well,
so I answered it right.
Yeah, I was agreeing with everything you said, especially the Fed Biz Ops thing, which is, if you guys don't know, a platform that shows all the government contracts that go out there. But I think you really hit the nail on the head, Mike, when you said you have to have a service, which would be in my case, and or a product really on the OE side that the government needs and will help them execute not only their mission, but get towards their goals that they've laid out in all these policy documents that we've mentioned, all these executive orders. So I think that's a good summation of it.
Kyle? Your thoughts, please.
Go to Fed Biz Ops. Kidding, it's called sam.gov now. Yeah.
You're serious about that?
Yeah, and that's honestly the answer I was prepping for, and you ruined that.
Sorry.
I'll say when you go on there are a lot of opportunities listed there. And I know that a lot of folks that are at this event this week aren't necessarily thinking about how they can support the DoD missions. But a lot of what you do here does support our mission, and there are announcements in sam.gov asking for technologies to support those areas. And so again, back to my requirements officer days, so we were the resource and requirements office for ONR. Please pull up ONR, Office of Research, S&T, right? This is where we're developing prototypes and whatnot. Please take a look at ONR's solicitations in sam.gov. Find what fits. You can do keyword searches on there. If you haven't been there, please go on there. If you're looking for a contract opportunity, please go on there, look at it. There are a lot of broad agency announcements asking for very specific research. Take a look. you might have a good fit. In responding, just one suggestion, this is from my experience, there's probably 3 or 4 years period in my Navy career where I was reviewing a lot of proposals. And a lot of the proposals that don't make the first shot are the ones that didn't answer the question, right? If you're not answering what's being asked of in the solicitation and Fed biz ops, if you're not answering the specific questions that are being asked, that's an easy way to throw out that proposal, right? And we want to give the research to the most qualified team. We want to get the best product that's going to support the warfight. But at the same time, there's limited bandwidth across the government. They can make excuses for us, but when we're reviewing those proposals, we're trying to get to, I think it was said yesterday, Craig mentioned this, lowest cost, technically acceptable is a term that we use. It's a requirement that we have. And more often than not, the best qualified office doesn't get the contract because it's, underbid. Or because they didn't answer the questions that were being solicited. So that's not the question that was being asked necessarily, but that's the government response. Tech Connect, if you're not familiar with that, it's a great opportunity, a great resource for Mike, I'm gonna try to paraphrase their vision. It's connecting technology innovators to the government. That work?
It works.
Okay, perfect. And I'll stop there.
I was gonna add one more thing, from the government perspective, Kyle just mentioned, all that great, but from a contractor, entrepreneur perspective, the one thing I try to do, and I think it goes to Mike's point too, before anything comes out on Fed Biz Ops or anything like that, try to anticipate where the government is going to go, because if you're out in the contracting field, you see what the market's doing. You can kind of value where you think the government is going to go next. And if you have that, there's a time limit on the Fed Biz Ops or SAM.gov announcements. So when those come out, you're all ready to go. You have your stuff ready and you already know your answers. You're not backtracking, trying to figure out, how do I answer this question? So that's one thing I would add in what I try to do, not always well, but try to anticipate where the new need is going to be on the government side.
And I just add one thing, I think it's funny, it's contentious. Yeah, I feel like Kyle, he shot across the bow, we have to respond, but no, I feel like if you have a product service where you need to figure out where the government it fits, and it's only one piece. So you may have a commercially viable product, but if you want government funding, I think you have to find the requirements or the program office that would be interested and go have a conversation with them. Don't just allow a government individual to read a response and throw out your proposal. So I think it's about relationships. It's obviously about the right technology and the right team to get the right solution, but you gotta figure out, and it's hard, but you can use resources like me, Red, Grant. We know people, we've been working in the system a while, we can point in the right direction.
Thank you. Brett, you want to take a shot at the question, particularly giving your background with the Pentagon, and you're advising now, you're in the private sector and you're working with I think Pangea filtration.
Yeah.
So I'd love to really get your thoughts on this, please.
Sure. Yeah, I think what Grant and Mike were commenting on is what I advise folks to do is like pre-position for opportunities. So inform the program managers before they create the solicitation. So you can actually help shape what solicitation comes out, and then you're in a good position to apply for it. Because a lot of times these solicitations come out and there's 2-3 weeks notice to put together something, and it's just not enough time to put a quality proposal together if you were caught off guard that it even came out. I think some of the frustrations that small businesses have, especially new ones approaching the government to the point of requirements, as Kyle was mentioning, is if a proposal has a requirement of Times New Roman size 12 font, follow it, because they will throw it out if you don't follow it. So make sure you check every single box, because they need to check every box. But there's a lot of other challenges. And this is why government relations or lobbyists are helpful at navigating this process. Lobbying has a bad taste in some people's mouth, but every do-gooder nonprofit has it. A lot of universities use lobbyists. And if you're in a rush to get funding or congressional support for something, it is a way to kind of fast track it. Because for someone new approaching the federal R&D world, there's a lot of really frustrating issues. So, you know, the requirements for proposals, how they define terms. So I was up till 3 AM last night working on a proposal for a prototype, and the word prototype under the other transaction authority is not really clearly defined. So the layperson would not interpret the word prototype the way they're looking for the word prototype. So defining terms, and a lot of private sector companies, they don't want to waste their time on an application that's not going to be successful. And trying to gauge your probability of winning or your P-win is pretty challenging when the government's not transparent about the statistics. So some of these proposals, solicitations don't mention the grant size that can be expected. So you don't know if you should ask for 500,000 or 3 million. You don't know if there's likely to be 100 applicants or 10 applicants. And a lot of times the government is cagey about these kind of things, and it's frustrating, but that's where someone with the inside knowledge, unfortunately, is kind of essential to really helping the private sector understand what's really worth pursuing. Private sector or universities to really understand what's worth pursuing. Trying to remember if there's any other aspect of the question to address, but
No, that was,
that's my airing of grievances. Thank you.
go ahead, please.
So just a couple other resources, just kind of thinking if I were you or an innovator, small business. Right now, there's a lot of money that has come through the IRA, and most of that went to DOE in the energy space. Again, talking energy resilience and climate. DOE saw a lot of that. A lot of the DOE solicitations are kind of requirements focused, but then there's a lot that's accepted some risk. And I can't speak to all of them, but the Advanced Research Projects Agency Energy, so one of DOE's programs, like they've got a huge budget now. They got a lot of money from the IRA to go invest in small business and startups, et cetera. And they've accepted that most of these are going to fail. And we talked a bit about that yesterday. A lot of government, can't accept failure. Here's an example of where we're accepting failure. We recognize, I say we, if I can speak for the government, recognize that if you don't take the risks, you don't realize the rewards. And I think ARPA-E, so just go to their website, ARPA Tech E, the DOE office, a lot of money openly soliciting, looking for a lot of the same things we are. And we're not asking for those things because we know DOE is. We know we can partner with DOE and take advantage of their research. Or
I want to bring up on the screen here, bear with me, let me share this for our viewers online. So these are the elements of star tides, and we're segmented in these 7 areas. For a while it was 6, and we recently added mobility and transportation. But we have a focus on, Star Tides is a global knowledge sharing network, and we're focused on energy, housing and infrastructure, water sanitation and hygiene, food or ag and food security. And we're having a presentation from Shepherd University and their Table Farm on ag this afternoon, ICT, mobility and transportation, and healthcare. We're focusing on energy, and of course our deliverables is around thought leadership, problem solving, solution development. I am curious on your perspectives when you talk about energy resilience. Where do these other elements fit in at all in the complete? Because we're focusing on one component, but I'd like to kind of broaden this out to the other areas and more of a holistic approach. Brett, did you want to give a first shot, please?
Sure. I mean, just glancing at the figure there. So at a DoD installation, you need energy to support all of this. So healthcare, the hospitals are considered a critical load at DoD installations. You want to make sure you have power to feed those. You need to make sure you have fuel for trucks, both emergency vehicles and fleet vehicles. Communications devices, which is an incredibly important thing to have up and running immediately in an emergency. That all requires resilient power. Food security, you need to make sure you have backup power for your refrigerator so the food doesn't spoil in several hours. Same thing with the water and sanitation. You can't clean your potable water if you don't have power to the water treatment plant. And then housing and infrastructure, you want to make sure people are comfortable in their homes. So heating, ventilation, And also, for the folks in the community that might not even be, in uniform, you need to make sure that we have power for folks so they can continue with their daily lives, whether it's caretaking or spouses of military folks to continue to keep their home office running. So, I mean, I'd say, I'm biased. I've worked for decades in energy. So energy is foundational to keep everything up and running. Open to, other perspectives on that.
So I can give a little bit of a perspective. I know we were talking about energy here, but really the office I support, energy installations and environment, and under that umbrella, it's installation resilience, which includes energy, water, mobility and transportation, information and communications. The only two that are kind of outside that realm, healthcare and agriculture. But I just say that all because in the one portion that I support of ASN, you have the majority of those. So like Brett said, they're all connected, but I can at least connect 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them to my specific office. So, in fairness to the government, they are looking at it in the same way you guys are. So I think that's a great model to have.
Well, please.
Yeah, just as you probably know, the DoD do a lot of pre-planning, right? A lot of exercises, disabled exercises, war games, things like that. And what we learn in these is there's a significant nexus where these exacerbating factors are something we've got to plan for, budget for, pre-position for. And just one example is communications for the exercises coming up. One of our scenarios is we're going to recall the mission essential personnel. How do you recall those folks? All cell towers go down, right? And if high wind, impacted environment, cell towers go down, what's the backup? And I think you could do that for every one of these. So there's a nexus between every one of these blocks here.
Mike, any thoughts?
What I would relate it to some of the work that we're currently doing with energy supportability analysis, where we're looking at how the Marines conduct operations at a Marine littoral regiment, which is going to be forward deployed on an island chain. We're looking to integrate expeditionary medicine and those requirements and figure out what's the energy and fuel that's needed to make that happen. So I can touch on a few of those like Grant, but I wouldn't have the experience with some of the other topics there.
Thank you. Before I ask each speaker to kind of summarize in a couple of takeaways from this event, any questions from the audience?
Well, it seems like the DoD challenges for delivery of energy, fuel, and logistics is getting tougher and tougher as consolidation takes place within the contracting environment. In 2019, at the Defense Logistics Agency Modernization Conference, there was a slide there that said that the U.S. had 651 fuel contracts around the world for supporting the various combat commands. In 2011, those fuel contracts for forward operating base fuel delivery was over $400 a gallon. At the same time, from 2008 to 2016, the 4 consecutive commandants from U.S. Transcom asked Congress for appropriations for hybrid airships to reduce the cost for delivering supplies and fuels around the world. So when we get to a point where we recognize that 91%, as of 2019, 91% of all U.S. Transcom cargo logistics is handled by private contractors. How are you going to expand your coordination with private contractors to do this Indo-Pacific exercise so that you can support forward operating bases and expeditionary forces?
So I want to take this one, and I'm sorry I don't have a great answer for you. But this is a challenge that the DoD has looked at pretty hard. They've engaged a lot of private activities, I'm not to say who, around providing those logistics. They recognize some of the warehouses and pre-positioning capabilities that we have are aging out, and they're looking at options to replace those that could potentially include privatization of logistics. I got stopped there. It's been a lot of discussions at the Pentagon and elsewhere around just that topic. I can't speak for DLA, but it's something we're looking at.
Other thoughts?
If I could, I don't have a great answer either, but just to clarify the 1 point on the $400 a gallon. So that was not a price that the DoD paid for a gallon of fuel. That's a result of an analysis called fully burdened cost of energy, where an analyst is looking at all the costs associated with getting the fuel to the battlefield, protection, logistics, assets, et cetera. So it's not there's no invoice showing $400 a gallon.
I took it from a DoD website
Sure,
this week.
it's
So
out there. It's not,
That's the figure that they showed.
and that's pretty much a worst case scenario. So that the standard price of fuel for any like contractual DoD purchase from DLA would show $3 to $4 a gallon typically.
Go ahead, please.
The former administration had executive orders to harden our bases across the United States and abroad. And Gold Star Miramar, 21 days of resiliency. We happen to know that most of the other bases don't have that. So in your opinion, how many of the bases have been hardened in the United States?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can't give you a quantitative answer to that. I will tell you though, that the discussions that we have are, hey, we can't keep showing Miramar as the only place we're doing all this good stuff. So it's out there and we know that. What we're kind of trying to figure out is how do we take Miramar as a showcase in that upper echelon of what it does and distribute those lessons learned to other installations. So there's different points, like nobody's going to come the next day and be the next Miramar. That they have a really great energy manager out there who I know very well. So it's partly staff, it's partly partnerships that he's used and leveraged. He's partnered with the state of California on some grants to get that microgrid. So I, again, can't give you a quantitative number, but that is the goal of our office, is to harden that installation security.
We're involved in that, and the Joint Base San Antonio has a very unique situation in that they own, City of San Antonio actually owns its utilities.
Another thing that's,
And that's very helpful.
yes,
But that is not the case
Right.
in most situations.
right. The only other thing I'll say about Miramar, and I don't know about San Antonio as well, but the 21-day islanding rather, what the microgrid did the past 2 years to prevent rolling blackouts in California is it actually took loads from the grid to take pressure off it, to keep the grid's integrity, so that I think the number was 3,000 homes in 5 hours that Miramar was able to provide power for, that the grid didn't have to alleviate the rolling blackouts. So that's really, I know we're getting into the last bit here, but if I were to summarize, that's the main thing I would say. It's, the partnership between the installation, especially on the shore side, and different entities, whether that's the state, whether that's the local utility, but we're all impacted by these climate, these climate change topics. So when we start looking at it together in kind of pooling our resources, whether that's DOE, DOD, state, local utility, we're better off for the future.
So I'll add one thing real quick if I can. We do have that number. So the DoD, they have that number. But a common theme, Miramar and others that are also Gold Star, community engagement. And it's these financial partnering plans with the local governments that are really enabling a lot of these things to happen. There's a big price tag on hardening everything all at once. So we are prioritizing with our resources, but also looking at how to be smarter and engaging with the local community to harden some of these installations. Over.
Thank you. Sir.
I have a perfect storm kind of a question you may or may not want to react to, but so like 2015, 16, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency came out with a request for proposals to the small business community because of a problem they articulated, saying that because commercial power grids are not hardened for various kinds of threats, including electromagnetic threats, they basically had no confidence public comment saying, therefore, they need the small business community to invent electromagnetic hardened microgrids. Because if they don't, the military bases may be out of service for weeks, months, or permanently. So 21 days, from their point of view, was irrelevant. You have to be ready to go 21 months or longer with nothing from the outside to be able to operate in island mode. Now, that's one part of the storm. The other one is the folks who run the largest utilities in the country, well, I won't even mention the names, so you can imagine who they are. The CEOs will confide in you privately that all of their business plans have never been developed in order to accommodate what will be the ultimate need for electric vehicles, right? And all of that infrastructure. So about halfway up that curve, we're going to have all these car chargers with no charges in them. And so you're going to have a collapse of the system to be able to provide something, which then requires local communities and local, whatever they're, a gas station or a hospital or whatever, to have a microgrid that is resilient, that's capable of providing the difference between what the grid would have provided and what they are required to, given all the electric vehicles and everything else going through electrification. So it seems like the need to be in island mode at a base is a really tough requirement that even the bases haven't met. But everybody's going to need to be able to do that in order to even drive their car. So it seems like a perfect storm of a very robust need in an island mode capability or autonomous mode, if you think of it that way, and what we're all going to need. And somehow I think the answer is going to have to be some way to make these things easily to finance or maybe even self-funding. But I just thought I'd get your thoughts about that perfect storm that we're coming to.
I can take a shot at my segment. So yes, hear you on that. Have to start somewhere though, right? So how does all of this get going? So Congress mandated in the FY23 NDAA that each service has to do, I believe it's 10 tabletop exercises, which simulate, weather catastrophes that could happen, meaning you would need to go in island mode. And they are what we call black starts, right? So you shut all the power off and see what breaks. So Congress has mandated that we do those, and we're following those directions. The thing I would say, 21 months, got it. But for us, and Kyle can speak to it more, but on the government side, we need to figure out, especially DOD, that first 7 days or 14 days, whatever it is, to make sure mission continuity is still there is the most important. And you did mention something that that I thought was really interesting, that at least my office is thinking, not my office, the office I support rather, is thinking about, and that's kind of charging as a service. So the DOD, they're not experts in installing EVs and running that business. So what does it look like if, a service provider comes in and does that? And that's that third party who, is at the NEX or wherever the gas station is on the location. So I know that's not a clear answer for you, but you're definitely hitting the right nodes on what we're talking about and trying to think through in support of the Navy on my side.
We have 2 minutes left. Any other thoughts on this question?
I mean, it might as well be mentioned that the silver lining with the electric vehicles is that there is an opportunity for them to also support resilience instead of just being a drain on the load, right? So that the Air Force was really forward leaning. I think it was 2010 or so. They did a pilot project with vehicle to grid system, but then I think got mothballed for a few years, but it's certainly being looked at a lot more closely these days now that electric vehicles are a significant part of the fleet.
Very good. Well, join me in thanking the panelists and for a very engaging discussion. So we're gonna end our session. We've got lunch next door around the corner in room 1202. We'll reconvene at 1:30 Eastern Daylight Time with the presentation on resilient food systems, building regional sustainable and cooperative farm networks. Got people down from Shepherd University in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And the second panel session, which will follow at 3 o'clock, is transdisciplinary approaches to community resilience, infrastructure and hazards, organized by the Center for Resilient Sustainable Communities here at George Mason University.
Also, please make sure to check out all the exhibits out on the lawn. Really interesting. You can actually eat some rice that was cooked in the solar cooker if you accept the disclaimer that it's not endorsed by GM Food Services. And see how to set up shelter after a disaster. Just some interesting exhibits out there. Go around and visit them.
Great,
Use
thank
your
you
lunch
all.
break to do that.